Okay, dear friends, so today we are very fortunate to have these great teachers with us. I think all of you know these great Bhantes because they both have been here before, and in fact it's a great moment for them too, because we have Bhante Rahula here to conduct our weekend meditation retreat this Saturday and Sunday. Actually, he got his ordination in Sri Lanka, and I think it was in '75. And after that, Bhante Punnaji taught Dhamma to him. So that's how they met in Sri Lanka. So they are good friends, long-term friends. So I think it's a great opportunity that they both met at Great Lakes Buddhist Vihara. So Bhante Punnaji, as you all know, he mostly lives in Malaysia these days. So during the summertime, he visits here. He usually escapes the winter. So when he comes to the United States during the summertime, he's traveling all over the country, teaching meditation and giving lectures on Buddhism. So we got this opportunity to have him with us even for a couple of days. So today we have this opportunity to listen to his great teachings. So thank you for coming, and I respectfully invite Bhante to deliver his lecture on, as he suggested, the thinking without thinker. Okay, thank you.
Why don't you come this way? Because you won't be able to see me, and I won't be able to see you also. So we begin by taking the 5 precepts. Say, Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddham Saranam Gacchami, Dhammam Saranam Gacchami, Sangham Saranam Gacchami, Dutiyampi Buddham Saranam Gacchami, Dutiyampi Dhammam Saranam Gacchami, Dutiyampi Sangham Saranam Gacchami, Tatiyampi Buddham Saranam Gacchami, Tatiyampi Dhammam Saranam Gacchami, Tatiyampi Sangham Saranam Gacchami, Panatipata Veramani Sikkhapadam Samadhiyami, Adinna Veramani Sikkhapadan Samadhiyami. Kamesu Micchachara Veramani Sikkhapadan Samadhiyami. Musavada Veramani Sikkhapadan Samadhiyami. Suramere Majjapamadatthana Veramani Sikkhapadan Samadhiyami. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Well, I'm very happy to see you all this evening, and I hope you'll be interested in what I'm trying to speak about. The topic is thinking without a thinker. That means, although we think, we are not really thinking. Thinking is happening to us. That means we are like machines. Now there is a kind of machine called the robot. So in a way we are like that, because according to even modern scientific thinking, we are organisms in an environment. Organism is like a machine, working according to the same laws of nature. The only difference is that an organism grows from a seed, like a tree growing from a seed, or even an animal growing from a seed. Human beings are also growing from a seed. So you see, but once it has grown up, it becomes an organism. The difference between an organism and an ordinary thing like a cup, if we think of a cup, the cup doesn't have eyes, the cup doesn't have ears, the cup doesn't have a nose, The cup doesn't have a tongue. And the cup doesn't have a feeling of sense of touch. But our body, there are these five senses. The eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, and the body. And these senses react to stimulations by the environment. Light is a movement in the environment, and light, when it comes to the eye, stimulates the eye, and the eye reacts to the stimulus, and that reaction is what we call seeing. The scientific word for that is perception. So in the same way, when some movements in the environment reach the ear, we will again react to that. The ear reacts. It's not the eye doesn't react to sound, but the ear reacts to the sound. So in the same way, the nose smell. That smell is also a disturbance in the environment. It affects the nose. Taste is a similar disturbance. Touch is also disturbance. So we are like machines. There are some machines that we know of. You put a coin and press the button, something comes out. So we are also like that. Sometimes if I use a wrong word, you might react to that and become angry maybe. That is also reaction. So we are just mechanisms. Now, this very important sutra in what is called the Majjhima Nikaya, today translated as the Middle and Saints. There is a book written by Bhikkhu Bodhi. If you take that sutra it's called the Mahatanha Sankaya Sutra. Now that particular sutra, there is a very interesting story where during the time of the Buddha, there was a monk by the name of Sati. This monk by the name of Sati had an opinion that what we call vijnana, sometimes translated as consciousness, it is something inside the body can even come out of the body and run about and then again come into the body. There are people who say that even in these what are called near-death experiences, the mind comes out of the body and observes the body, and then again re-enters the body. And when people speak of rebirth, sometimes people say this mind that was inside the body goes out and then begins to occupy another body. That is what is called reincarnation. According to the Christians, they believe that when a child is born, God puts a soul into the child. And this soul will go on till the time of death. So that putting the soul into the body is called incarnation. But at the time of death, if the soul comes out of the body, that is called discarnation. So when Buddhists speak about rebirth, they think that discarnate spirit re-enters a body. That is what is called reincarnation. So many Buddhists also think this is a thing like that, reincarnation. The soul comes. They don't call it the soul because the Buddhists say that the Buddha said there is no such thing as a soul, but still they begin to use the word vijnana or consciousness. And that word is used instead of the soul, and the description is also similar to the soul. So this is why at that time, during the time of the Buddha, when this particular monk called Sati was speaking about this vijnana which is inside the body and it can come out and re-enter another body, the Buddha pointed out that that is not correct. That way of thinking is not correct. There is no such thing like that. That's what the Buddha pointed out. So it is very important to read that sutra. The wonderful thing is, if the Buddha denied that there was no such thing, then he should have explained how this thing called rebirth takes place. Because people talk about a thing called rebirth. in that particular sutra, the Buddha doesn't talk about rebirth. Instead of talking about rebirth, he begins to talk about a thing called ahara. Ahara, the word ahara means taking food or feeding. And he speaks of 4 kinds of ahara. He calls it Kabalinkara ahara, Mano Sanchetana ahara, Phassa ahara, and Vijnana ahara. These are the Pali words. What he calls Kabalinkara ahara is the kind of food that we eat as human beings or even as animals. They also take food. That taking food is the ahara, that is the physical food that we take in. Then Mano Sanchetana ahara. This is a very interesting term that we should understand. Here the Buddha uses 2 words. One is mano and the other is sanchetana. Because it's very important to understand that the Buddha has pointed out that there is no such thing or separate entity like the body which can be called the mind. But he pointed out that what we normally call the mind are 3 activities of the body. Now we have to distinguish between an entity and an activity. An entity is something that exists. And to exist means to occupy space and time. If we take a table or chair or even a cushion, that occupies space. Occupying space means we can measure the length, the breadth and the height. And that is, if we multiply the length, breadth and height, that is called volume. That volume really means the amount of space occupied by that object. And it also occupies time. That means it has a past, a present and a future. That is the meaning of occupying time. So when we think of the cushion, you find that it can have a volume like that, then breadth and height, and it has a past, present and future. So when we speak of an entity, we are speaking of something that occupies space and time, an entity. But when we talk about an activity, activity doesn't have a length, breadth and height. It might sometimes appear like that, like for example, when we speak of a flame, what is a flame? Is the flame an entity or an activity? The flame also begins to occupy a certain amount of space, but still it is an activity. Because when the flame goes out, do we speak about where the flame went? If I ask the question, where did the flame go? How would you answer that question? Has it gone anywhere? It hasn't gone anywhere. It was an activity which was what is today called a chemical activity. It's a chemical activity. And that stopped. If the activity can only begin and it can stop. And if we talk about the time, we can only talk about how long the activity was going on. But every fraction of a second, the activity is a new activity. So it's very important to understand the difference between an activity and an entity. Now today we have this modern kind of science which is well known to most people who are educated. It is called quantum physics. And what they are talking about is, the scientists have been talking about a thing called matter and energy. When we speak of matter, we are talking about an entity that occupies space and time. But when we talk about energy, we are talking about an activity. And now, after conducting so many experiments, they have come to the conclusion that there are no real entities in the world. They are all activities. the problem. And then when we think of the teachings of the Buddha is saying the same thing. That everything that we speak of is an activity. And the word that the Buddha uses is sankhara. The word sankhara really means an activity. And he spoke about sabbe sankhara anicca. All activities are things that come and go, dependent on conditions. When the conditions are present, the activity begins. When the conditions are absent, it ceases to be. Hetum paticca sambhutam hetu bhanga nirujjati. And this is what the Buddha is trying to point out in this sutra. When he begins to talk about these two things that we normally call the mind. One is, the Buddha used the word mano, and the other word is chitta. Today the modern scientists and psychologists, they have two words to refer to this. They are also aware of this. The thinking part of the mind, thinking, that is called mano. Another part of the mind is emotions, like anger, desires, fears, worries. These are emotions. And the emotions the Buddha called chitta. And the chitta cannot think. Only the mano can think. The mano can form concepts. Chitta can only get excited because it is a movement and it can stop. So when the Buddha used here mano sanchetana ahara, that means for our existence we not only need food, but we are also doing what we call thinking, and we are also having emotions. Now, if we don't have any thinking and if we don't have emotion, we are not really existing. So our existence, what we call our existence, is thinking and emotions. That is called the mano sanchetana ahara. It's not only a physical existence of the body. This is what we call the mental existence, the mind. Then we have what is called Phassa Ahara. Phassa is commonly translated today as contract. But the real meaning of the word phassa is not contract. Phassa is the formation of concepts. That is called cognition. Phassa really should be translated as cognition. And then Vijnana Ahara. The word Vijnana is also translated today as consciousness. But here the word Vijnana is used by the Buddha in two ways. The seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, this is all called Vijnana. Chakku Vijnana means the eye perception. Sota Vijnana is the ear perception. Gana Vijnana is the nose perception. Jivha Vijnana is the tongue perception. Kaya Vijnana is the body perception. That is the activity of the senses. A certain person came once to the Buddha and asked a question. We have these 5 senses, and each sense provides some information. The eye, when activated, we can see things. But the ear can only hear sounds. So what we see is very different from the sound. What we smell with the nose is another different thing. What we taste is another different thing. And when we touch, we feel the touch. That is also different. Where do these things meet? That was the question. So the Buddha said, Mano. That is where these things meet. Mano. And today, scientists are aware of this thing. What is this mano? Today the scientists are aware that from the eye there is a telephone wire going to the brain. It is called the optic nerve. Another telephone wire goes from the ear to the brain, the auditory nerve. Another telephone wire goes from the nose to the brain. Like that, these are the nerves going to the brain, and when the brain receives this information, the brain begins to think. And in this thinking, The brain uses all the information coming from the different senses, put them together, and not only that, even the experiences coming from the past is taken into this, and a decision is made, which is an interpretation of what was seen and heard and smelled and tasted and touched. That interpretation forms a concept, the formation of a concept. The senses only give a percept, but the brain forms a concept. And with the formation of the concept, what is called consciousness arises. You become conscious of something outside. And that is called mano-vijnana. The Buddha called it mano-vijnana. So it's different from chakku-vijnana and sota-vijnana, which is the perception of the eye and the ears and so on. The brain perception is not a perception but a conception, which is also called cognition. And according to that interpretation, another thing happens. An emotion is aroused. If you like what you saw, that is an emotion. If you hate what you saw, that is also an emotion. That reaction to what was seen and cognized, the emotion was aroused. Today the modern psychologists are aware of this. There is a school of psychology called cognitive psychology. And these people say that cognition is what begins the emotional reaction. And therefore, the earlier psychologist, who is called Sigmund Freud, he also examined these things and he thought that emotions cannot be got rid of. He began to see that emotions are creating problems. Because if you get angry, you might even kill a person. Lot of damage can be done. All the crimes in the world, all the wars in the world, the terrorism, all these things are because of emotions. And Freud saw that emotions should be controlled. But he thought that emotions cannot be eliminated. But these later psychologists, Freud was talking about these things in the beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Then the cognitive psychologists came up very much later, also in the 20th century, but somewhere in 1960s. And they pointed out that emotions can be got rid of by changing the way you interpret your circumstances. So this is a very important thing that the Buddha used. There is a book of verses called the Dhammapada. The first verse in the Dhammapada, the Buddha points out, Mano Pubbangama Dhamma. There, mano means the cognitive process, which is the activity of the brain, the thinking. And that is what arouses the emotion if it is done in the wrong way. That's what the Buddha points out. Manasache paduttena vasativa karotiva tatona dukkhamang veti. If one begins to interpret circumstances in the wrong way, anger can arise or some emotion can be aroused, and as a result, that person will begin to behave in the wrong way, and the result will be suffering. But if a person begins to interpret situations in the right way, the mind will be calm, kind, and also it will lead to happiness. It is very important to understand that the Buddha used this same principle that modern psychologists are now gradually beginning to discover. He used this to get rid of emotions altogether. Lust, hate, and delusion. Lust is the desire for pleasure. Hate is the hatred of pain. And delusion is the notion of self. Because all emotions are self-centered. And because of this, the concept of self is aroused when the emotions are active. And it is with this concept of self that all crime, wars, and all the problems in the world arises. The interesting thing is that in the human being, the mind is developed to the point where the thinking has created what is called modern science and the modern scientific technology, which has created the electric light, air conditioning, the motor vehicles, the airplanes, rockets even going to the moon and even beyond. The wonderful thing is that if we don't know how to go to some place, in your own vehicle, they give directions. Some voice begins to talk and give you directions. You turn left here or turn right here and give directions. And then ultimately you go there and it says, now you have reached your destination. You see this wonderful thing. All this is because of science. Science has done wonderful things. And that is because of this thinking part of the brain, the thinking part of the mind. What we call the mind is an activity of the body. It's not a separate thing, separate from the body. It's an activity of the body. And the emotions are also an activity of the body. And it is the emotion that is creating this thing called stress. Today people talk about stress and stress management. But the Buddha called dukkha is really the stress. That is very important to understand. It was a professor in Canada called Hans Selye who started talking about stress, and he wrote several books on stress. And in talking about stress, he pointed out that stress is not something that is in the environment. Stress is how we react to what is going on in the environment. It is the reaction to whatever is going on in the environment. That means the emotional reaction. And it is that emotional reaction that the Buddha called tanha. Today translated as craving. Tanha is not craving. The emotional reaction. Because craving means a kind of addiction to a drug. This is not a thing like that. Hatred is not a craving, but tanha is also the hatred to pain, but is unpleasant. So the real translation should be the emotional reaction. So it is this emotional reaction that is creating all the problems. It's very important to understand. And it is this emotional reaction that Hans Selye called stress. And in speaking about stress, that Professor Hans Selye used a term called the general adaptation syndrome. It's a technical term, the general adaptation syndrome. And he pointed out that there are 3 stages in this stress, in this general adaptation syndrome. The first stage is called the alarm reaction. The second stage is called the stage of resistance. And the third stage is called the stage of exhaustion. The wonderful thing is that these stages are what the Buddha called dukkha, today translated as suffering. Now, in describing dukkha, the Buddha used some words. Soka parideva dukkha domanasa upayasa. Now, Hans Selye says that the alarm reaction is what is called the fight and flight response. That alarm reaction is like when the alarm begins to sound or ring, people become excited and try to run away because the house may be burning, you see, may be on fire. So in the same way, when something happens like a close relative dies, like the mother dying, or the father dying, or the brother dying, or the sister dying, all these things, people begin to cry and lament. That is what he calls the alarm reaction. And that alarm reaction, the Buddha describes as soka and parideva. Soka means grief, parideva means lamentation. Same thing. And then Selye begins to talk about the second level, where if the person who is crying and lamenting because someone died, if that crying and lamenting continues for 1 month, what happens? That person is not able to eat, no appetite in the food. That body becomes sick as a result. The body becomes sick means there will be pain in the body and at the same time pain in the mind. Because of the sickness. So, that is what the Buddha called dukkha and domanassa. Dukkha is the pain in the body. Domanassa is the pain in the mind. Dukkha and domanassa. Then Selye points out that if it continues even beyond 1 month, and it goes on to 2 months, or 3 months, or 4 months, what will happen to this individual? That person either will commit suicide or will die through exhaustion. That is what is called the stage of exhaustion. And that also the Buddha points out. Upayasa. Upayasa means exhaustion. You see, the wonderful thing is, I don't think this Hans Sali was trying to quote the Buddha, but in his own way, he comes to the same point, the dukkha. So this is why the effort of the Buddha was to bring an end to this dukkha. And the only way to bring an end to the dukkha is to get rid of the emotional reaction which is called tanha. Today translated as craving, but it is the emotional reaction. And to get rid of the emotional reaction, the Buddha points out 3 steps. Sila, Samadhi, and Panya. Sila is to discipline your behavior. Even if you become angry or if you become greedy for things, don't act on that emotion. That is to control the behavioral part. You don't express the emotion. That is called sila. Once you have stopped the emotional expression, what remains? The anger has not disappeared. Anger is there, but you don't act angrily. Are you happy in that situation? You are not happy. So the next step is to learn to get rid of that anger. That is what is called samadhi. Some people translate the word samadhi as concentration. But samadhi is not concentration, but relaxing the body and calming the mind. Samadhi is to relax the body and calm the mind. So what is called samadhi is better called stillness of the mind, stilling the mind. And what is stillness? Are you doing something to become still? To become still, you don't have to do anything. The important thing is to stop doing things. So the real samadhi is not concentration, but to give up all concentration and all activities, to relax the body and calm the mind. That is the real samadhi. I translate samadhi as the equilibrium. The equilibrium is the real stillness. It is a unification of the mind. And once the mind has become tranquil, then you are able to think properly. It is the calm mind that can think well. And we have to change the thinking, how we interpret our circumstances. That is what is called vipassana. Today translated as insight meditation. That word insight is an interesting word. Insight. In means something inside. Sight means seeing. Seeing what is inside. That is very interesting because that is exactly what the Buddha pointed out. You have to look within. Instead of focusing your attention on what is going on outside, you must start focusing your attention on what is going on inside. What is going on inside is your reaction to what is going on outside. And it is this reaction which is called stress. And therefore, if you look at what is going on inside, that reaction stops. The reaction continues because you are looking at what is going on outside. But the moment you take your mind from that and start looking at what is going on inside, first you look at the body. What is happening to your body? Your body is becoming tensed. So when you observe that, the body begins to relax. Then you begin to observe how you feel in the body, the feeling in the body. Are you comfortable or are you uncomfortable? When you become aware of that, the discomfort disappears because the body relaxes and you begin to feel comfortable. So you look at the body in two ways, whether it is tense or whether it is feeling uncomfortable. Then you look at the mind in two ways, the emotional state and the thought in the mind. So looking at the emotional state is called Chittanupassana. Chitta is the emotional state or the mood. We have a word called the mood in English. So we look at how emotion, what state is the mood, whether it is emotionally excited or whether it is calm and tranquil. So when you become aware of the emotional excitement, it begins to calm down. Because this is something that is happening quite unconsciously. You are not even aware of it. So when you become conscious of that emotional excitement automatically stops. And then you become aware of the thought. The thought is how you interpret your circumstance. You begin to see that this is only an interpretation. So if you interpret in a different way, or if you become aware of the interpretation and how the interpretation is creating the problem, the interpretation stops and the mind calms down. So what we call Satipatthana is really becoming aware of this, what is going on inside, and the body relaxing and the mind calming down. When the body relaxes and the mind calms down, you have gained what is called samadhi. And with that samadhi, now your mind is free of this wrong kind of interpretation. And you begin to become aware of how your mind is creating the world that you are aware of, and even the self that you are aware of. You begin to understand that the world and the self are really creations of your mental process. There is no special thing called a mind. It is simply an activity of the body. So, understanding this itself, there occurs what is called a paradigm shift. It's a new, very interesting word, a paradigm shift. That is a shift in the way you look at whatever you are looking at. And that shift is, instead of looking at what you are looking at, you are looking at the process of perception. When you begin to look at the process of perception, you begin to understand that the whole world that you are aware of is really inside your own mind. You see, our eye works like a camera. And when you take a picture with the camera, Where is the picture? The picture is inside the camera and not outside. So when we open our eyes, if we see something, what we see is a picture in my own mind. So this is the real discovery which creates the paradigm shift and points out that the world that we are aware of is all inside our mind. This is why in one of the sutras, a certain Deva, a celestial being, comes to the Buddha and asks the question, if a person travels in space at a very high speed, will that person be able to come to the end of the world? The Buddha says no. And then he says, without reaching the end of the world, you cannot bring suffering to an end. And then he says, this world, the beginning of the world, the end of the world, and the way leading to the end of the world is in this fathom-long body itself. With its perception and conception. That perception and conception is creating the world. And this world can be stopped only when we have understood this properly. You know, the Buddha is called Tathagata. It's very interesting, that word, Tathagata. Tat means that. We have the English word that. This Pali and Sanskrit word tat means that. Agata means arrived at. So agata means arrived at that. That means you have understood that. That means you have understood that what we call that, which is what is outside, is really inside. It is only when we have understood this properly, that is the understanding of what is called the Paticca Samuppada, what is today translated as dependent origination. I call it the antecedental concurrence. Paticca is Praticca. That means it comes before. That is the meaning of the word antecedent. It's an incident that comes before. the antecedent. But although it something that depends on conditions, but at the same time, when we say samuppada, samuppada means it arises at the same time. Simultaneous occurrence. And that is what is called concurrence. Concurrence means occurring at the same time. Now this is something that these days the modern philosopher Bertrand Russell has been talking about this antecedents. He talks about three kinds of antecedents: the spatial antecedent, the temporal antecedent, and a logical antecedent. Now, if you have a row of pillars, one coming after the other, we are talking about a spatial antecedent in space. But if we just tap one coming after the other, the taps, the one tap comes after the other, that is a temporal antecedent in time. One coming after the other in time. But there is another kind of antecedent. If we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1 comes before 2, 2 comes before 3, 3 comes before 4, and so on. Is also antecedent, but it's not in space or time. That is called a logical antecedent. So when we talk about the Paticca Samuppada, we are really talking about a series of antecedents but occurring at the same time. They are logical antecedents, not spatial or temporal. So it's very important to understand these things, and only when we have understood this properly, that a paradigm shift occurs where we don't really exist. There was a person who was meditating during the time of the Buddha. He was not a disciple of the Buddha, but he was a lone meditator. And he thought he had reached the highest point in meditation. But his mother had died and born in the heavens or the Devalokas, and she was able to see what was going on in his mind, and she saw that he has not attained the highest point in meditation, and that he is also going to die soon. So she called the person and said, I am your mother, and I have seen that you have not attained the highest goal. The Buddha is in such and such a place. Go soon and learn the method of meditation from him. And you are now about to die also. So he went as fast as he could, and the Buddha was going on Pindapata, going on the begging round. And then, when he went there, he said, please, oh Buddha, now please help me. I want to learn how to become an arahant. So he said, wait a little, I am going on Pindapata. I have no time now. After I come from the Pindapata, I will teach you. Wait till you finish the Pindapata because I might die at any moment. So the Buddha looked into his mind and then saw that he was going to die, really going to die. So he said, okay, I will teach you now. You will listen to me properly. And the main point he pointed out was, Ditte dittavatam bhavisati. That's the main thing. In the seeing, S-E-E-I-N-G, seeing, in the seeing, there is only the seeing, S-E-E-I-N-G. That means the process of seeing is the only thing there. There is no real object out there. It is only the subjective process of seeing. When he thought about that, he finally attained the emancipation, became an arahant. And then he said, now please ordain me as your disciple. He said, it is not possible for me to ordain you till you have brought a bowl and a robe. So he had to go in search for bowl and a robe. And ultimately, while going in search of the bowl and the robe, a buffalo attacked him and he died. So the other monks asked the Buddha, now what happened to him? Because he died. So the Buddha said, don't worry, he has become emancipated. So the most important thing here was to realize that what you see is only the seeing. There is no real object that is seen. The modern Western philosophers have been thinking about this and discussing this same point. But ultimately it was the Buddha who found the real solution here. And that is how he brought all suffering to an end. So it is very important to understand this. And it is only then that you really understand the meaning of thinking without a thinker. There is no person who is doing the thinking. There is a book written by another professor of psychology and physiology or neuropsychology. His name is Dr. Penfield. If you read that book, there he points out that all the research that has been done today points out that there is no real mind to talk about. There is only the body. It's very interesting to understand this, and many books have been written now about this. The subject called psychology began as a study of the mind, but ultimately they couldn't find the mind to study. There was only the body. So they called it the study of human behavior, not the study of the mind. They could only study human behavior. So I think you have understood, and I don't need to go beyond this. And if you have any questions, you can ask now, and I'll try to answer as far as I can.
Could you please explain more about sankharas? Could you please explain more about the sankharas?
Now there is a small problem. I can't hear you properly.
Sankharas and the rebirth, what exactly is that?
She's asking about the she's asking about the sankhara. Sankhara and the rebirth process, how these things are connected.
Yeah, that is very interesting, but the problem is we have to stop thinking about rebirth, because if we begin to think about rebirth, there must be a person to be reborn. If there is no person here, how can we talk about rebirth? You know, there was in the history of Buddhism, at a certain stage, one school of Buddhism began to say that there is no individual here, because if you analyze the body and the what is called the self, you can talk about 5 things, what is called the pancha khanda, the 5 khandas, what are today called the 5 aggregates. By analyzing this, you begin to see that there is no individual. It's like taking a book and tearing all the papers and say, this is a combination of papers here. There is what we call, the book is only a collection of papers. So in a similar way, if we analyze the body, we can say there is no real individual here. Then there were some people who started saying, how can you say there is no individual? Because if there is no individual, who commits the karma and who receives the vipaka, and who is the person who is reborn? Then some people started saying there is a person here that is called the Puggalavada. The word person was Puggala. So they started this thing called Puggalavada. And then some other people started saying, why do you combine only the parts of the person? Everything in the world is composed of parts. And if you combine the parts, that object exists. And so they started that school of thought called not only the Buddha, Sabbang Arti or Sarvastivada. The Sarvastivada means that everything exists. So like that, there were all different schools that started, and during the time of the Emperor Asoka, there were 18 schools of Buddhism, interpreting the teachings of the Buddha in 18 ways. And this is the problem. Today, there are so many schools of Buddhism interpreting the teachings in different ways. So it's very important to understand the original teaching of the Buddha. There is a sutra called the Sabbasava Sutra, which begins by pointing out that the ordinary human being normally thinks, did I exist in the past? How did I exist in the past? Will I exist in the future? How will I exist in the future? Am I existing now? How am I existing now? If you keep on thinking in this way, what is called the Sakkaya Ditthi, that view that I exist, comes into being. And once you get into that thinking, you will never be able to reach nirvana. And then the Buddha points out that the Arya Shravaka, the disciple of the Buddha, thinks only what is suffering, what is the cause of suffering, what is the end of suffering, and what is the way leading to the end of suffering. So he talks about suffering, but not about the person who suffers. This is the important thing. This is what I was trying to point out, that there is the thinking going on, but there is no thinker. So without thinking of an individual that suffers, we have to understand suffering. What is suffering? It is the conflict between emotion and reality. The reality is all things that come and go. And emotion is something that wants permanence and existence. Emotion wants to exist, but there is nothing really that exists. That is the reality. And because emotion is going against reality, that creates suffering, unhappiness. So it is only a process of mental activity and physical activity that is going on. There is no real individual present here. That's the important thing to understand.
When Buddha went through during his enlightenment, when he talks about I went past all those rebirths, what exactly was Buddha trying to say according to the sutta?
Well, again?
So she's asking, when Buddha attained enlightenment,
Yeah.
he saw his own existence, previous lives. So what was happening there? What he was
The
trying to-
problem is this, that although the Buddha understood this, he had to speak to people who don't understand that. So because he had to speak to people, he had to use the common words to explain things. This was the biggest problem. So we have to understand that the Buddha spoke in two ways, and there are two kinds of truth. What is called Paramartha Satya and Sammuti Satya. Sammuti Satya is the conventional truth. That is what normal people talk about. So, the Buddha, when he spoke to enlightened people, he was able to talk in the Sammuti, the Paramartha Satya, which is the ultimate truth. But when he spoke to the ordinary people, he had to use concepts like I was living in the past or I was going to live in the future. That kind of past, present, future and the idea of existence is all the conventional truth. So this is the problem. So I hope you understood these things, and we bring this to an end. So today you have been at least thinking about the teachings of the Buddha, and by further thinking and also reading the proper books, you will be able to understand these things more and more. But the real understanding comes only when you begin to practice the proper way of living or practicing meditation, which is really practicing what is called the Noble Eightfold Path. But I don't call it the Noble Eightfold Path. I call it the supernormal eightfold way. I call it supernormal because the normal way of thinking has to be eliminated in order to really understand this. So the person who begins to follow this method enters a supernormal state. Just as the modern psychologists and psychotherapists really deal with abnormal people, trying to bring them to a normal state. But what the Buddha did was to deal with normal people to bring them to a supernormal state. That is the meaning of Arya Puddgala. The word Arya is supernormal. The ordinary normal state is called Putujjana. The word Putujjana refers to the normal individual. Arya refers to the supernormal individual. Because the supernormal person doesn't think, I am. Although he may be using the word I am to discuss with the other people, but still he knows that that is not the real meaning. This is why that problem comes up between the ultimate truth and the conventional truth. Okay, so I hope you understood these things, and you will understand better if you begin to learn to practice the teachings of the Buddha and learn to meditate and purify the mind and become fully enlightened and awaken from the dream of existence. Because we are simply dreaming that we exist, although we don't really exist. It's only when we have understood that properly that we become free from what is called death. Just as existence is a delusion, death itself is a delusion that arises from the wrong way of thinking. That is the meaning of Nirodha Samapatti. It is the paradigm shift from the idea of existence to the idea of impersonal experience. That is an experience without a personality here. So, let us share the merits that we have acquired by listening to the Dhamma and understanding the Dhamma to some extent. Let us share the merits with all departed relatives and all beings by reciting Idang me jnatinam hotu Sukita hontu jnatayo Idang me jnatinam hotu Sukita hontu jnatayo Idang me jnatinam hotu Sukita hontu jnatayo. Now may these merits also help every one of you to gain freedom from all sufferings of samsara and attain the highest and most supreme bliss of nirvana. Say sadhu, and I chant a blessing to bless you all. Abhivadana silissa niccang vaddapachayino Chattaro dhamma vaddanti ayuvanno sukhang balang ayurarogya sampatti sagga sampatti mevacha ato nibbana sampatti imina te samijjatu.
So let's take this opportunity to thank Bhante, Most Honorable Bhante Punnaji, to come to our temple and to spend a couple of days with us and to give this very meaningful, very insightful, very valuable, precious Dhamma teachings to us. So that was so enlightening. So let's make some wholesome wishes for Bhante also. By the power of all the merits that we accumulated by listening to these teachings, contemplating this deep Dhamma, by the blessings of the Noble Triple Gem, may he be well, happy and peaceful. May he enjoy very good physical and mental well-being, and may he realize the Four Noble Truth and attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So I think we have a great opportunity to practice what we just heard on the weekend with Bhante Yogavachara Rahula here. So please take this very valuable, important, precious opportunity to practice meditation on Saturday and Sunday with Bhante. So I invite you all to join. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming. All blessings to you. May offer any pirikara for Bhante for his travel expenses in appreciation of his great teaching. Thank you.